At the beginning of the year, I made a video where I talked about some of the most advanced knitting techniques that are out there, but I truly believe that any technique can be learned, and if you are more of a beginner knitter, it might take you a while to feel confident to do some of these techniques, but that doesn't mean that you can't do them. So I thought I would add more of these type of techniques to a new video because some of you have really good suggestions and because I kept coming up with more ideas. So here are some more difficult or advanced knitting techniques that I think everybody should at some point at least try or learn, or that you will encounter in some of the most advanced projects that are out there. But first, here's a quick word by today's video sponsor, Unraveled. We've all had decision fatigue before, even when it comes to our hobbies, like what yarn to use, what project to start next, what project to go with which yarn that you already have. I get it. Sometimes you don't want to do all the thinking, you just want to grab a project and get started. Whether you're a beginner or a very experienced knitter, Unraveled takes out the guesswork by offering beautifully curated pattern kits for all skill levels. You just pick up the project that you want and the color, and Unravel will send you a box with everything you need: needles, pattern, and their incredibly soft Peruvian yarn. I'm working on the project that they sent me, which is the Baby Sakura blanket, which is an intermediate level baby blanket. And honestly, this is one of the best kits I've ever gotten. The quality of the yarn and the materials, all the needles, everything is just so well done. If you want to try a kit for yourself, head over to unravel.store and use my code TheKnitYorker to get 10% off on your first kit. And I'm just gonna keep knitting this beautiful blanket, and maybe in a few weeks I'll show you what it looks like because I'm really excited with how pretty this pattern is. So let's get started with one that a lot of people fear, and a lot of designers as well, because it is a little bit of math. This one is short rows, or sometimes they're called partial rows. And what short rows are is basically, instead of knitting a whole round or a whole row, you are kind of only knitting during a small section of it, and this creates kind of like shaping in your knitting. And so basically what you do is you're going back and forth in your knitting, either in a round or a row, and you add short rows at a certain point so that instead of knitting the whole row, you're just in that little section. You will see them a lot for things like shaping shoulders, shaping sometimes bust. You will sometimes see them in a few types of heels in socks. And I maybe like for creating custom fit in the bust area. And I like to use them in my patterns for creating like a higher backside on a sweater or cardigan. And also in my Through the Grapevine shorts, I use short rows to make the backside of the short higher so that it covers your butt better, basically. So it creates that kind of special shaping. And there are very many different techniques of short rows, or like German short rows and other types of short rows. But the idea is always the same. You're just creating shaping. I don't think that they're difficult. I think you just have to read the instructions very carefully and count very carefully. I think at some point I made a tutorial video about how to do short rows for my own projects. And I mean, once you understand how they work, they're not that scary. The next technique is double knitting, and I actually just knitted my first ever project with double knitting very recently. I made a whole video where I talk about the Minu cardigan, which is the one that included that, and in that video I used double knitting for the button band of the cardigan. But what double knitting is literally what the name says. When you are usually knitting, you have a front side and a back side. Even on the round, you usually have, a side that it will be towards the front, and then a back side. If you're knitting, for example, stockinette, it'll be the knit side will be the front and the purl side will be the back. In the case of double knitting, it is knit in such a way where you actually have the front side on both sides. So it is double faced, basically. And I was a little bit scared of this one too, because I didn't really understand how that could even work. But once I actually followed the steps, it made a lot of sense, and it's not really that hard to do. It just looks really professional, and again, you just gotta pay attention. So double knitting, the way it works is that you alternate rows, so that one row is the front and one row is the back always. So you will be knitting and then skipping a stitch and then knitting like that the whole section where you're double knitting, and then you turn your work around and do the opposite side of skipping stitches, and that way you just create that double knitting look. And it is great for things like the cardigan edge, because again, you get like a really crisp edge. So a lot of finishings can be done with double knitting. It's also used to do obviously like some sort of project that is double-sided. So if you are using color work, you can have basically double-sided color work and have like the opposite color on the other side, which creates a really cool effect. A lot of people like to do this for things like scarves, and it kind of creates this really cool effect of, again, double-sided, double color, double knitting, double. And I have not tried double knitting in color work yet. I feel like that's the next step, but now that I've already tried it, I know that it's not that hard. And a lot of these techniques are like this, but it's not about it being super hard. It's more about like a technique that you probably have to pay a lot of attention, especially the first time you try it. But once you kind of get into it, it makes a lot of sense. The next technique I'm going to talk about is knitting in the round using the magic loop, or just the magic loop in general. And you probably have heard the word magic loop before if you've ever tried to learn to knit in the round. I remember when I was a very beginner knitter and I only had like straight needles, because I didn't really know that circular needles existed yet and that you needed them in order to knit in the round, or double pointed needles. So I, was kind of like broke my brain. How did you even create anything that's not like flat? And so once I discovered knitting in the round, and then I realized that there were all these different sizes of lengths, and I just remember, like, because I'm self-taught, I had to just discover all of this on my own. And like once I discovered knitting in the round, I was like, okay, but like, what if this is smaller? How am I gonna knit it? And that's when, just by Googling, I found out about magic loop. So magic loop is a technique in which you can use basically any size of circular needle, especially if they're like longer than your project, it works better. And what you do is you create a circle regardless of the length of your needle by pulling some of the cable of the circular needle and kind of keeping it away so that you're always gonna have that circle. But basically what this does is like it liberates you from having different sizes of circular needles, and especially for projects that are smaller. I like to knit socks with double pointed needles, but other types of like sleeves, for example, I end up preferring magic loop than having like really short needles. I just don't really like short needles and feeling like tight. So magic loop just comes in to save the day, and no matter the length of your needles, you can knit basically. The next one is grafting, also known as the Kitchener stitch, and this is one that really took me a long time to learn by heart. That every time I needed to do the Kitchener stitch, I would just like have to look up Kitchener stitch and pull out like the instructions or some sort of charts to remember the order of things. But basically what it is a finishing stitch that manages to basically create knit stitches to complete two edges and kind of make them seamless, create like a seamless connection. So it's really great for socks, for example, when you're like knitting the very end of the sock and you have the same number of stitches on either side, you graft them together so that it looks like it was always connected seamlessly. It is also great for things like shoulders, if you are ever knitting like the front and the back of a project, especially bottom up, and you need to unite the shoulders and make them look seamless. Anything like that will be great for this stitch. So you will see it sometimes in a lot of patterns as just like a finishing technique. And the way that it works is that you use a weaving or a darning needle to put the leftover yarn, and then you basically go back and forth between the two needles that hold the stitches parallel to each other, and you go between the front and the back, and you're basically knitting by using the darning needle and creating that connection. So you just have to follow the steps. There's usually like 4, I think. So either you like go through as if to knit or go through as if to purl. And again, like the first 50 times that you do use the Kitchener stitch, I literally had to look at the instructions every single time. At this point, I learned it by heart. I kind of understood the logic, so it's not so hard to do. but it does become daunting, and if you get lost, it's like but it's usually, you know, smaller number of stitches, so I haven't had an issue. And so yeah, this is like a more advanced finishing technique that if you manage to master it, which again is not hard, just requires attention, you will end up with like some really nice finishes in a lot of projects. Next up, we've got a provisional cast on, and as the name says, this is when you manage to cast on with some sort of provisional stitches that you can later remove and have those cast on be live stitches again. So this can be helpful for if you need to go back because of however the project is built, that you have to go back and like extend from the end. I recently did a cardigan that I used provisional cast on. I think also for the shoulders. I forget how it worked, but the way that it was built, you kind of started at the shoulders and knit all the way to the back, and then you went back to the shoulders, undo the provisional cast on, and then continue forward. So it's helpful for that sort of construction where you basically need to go back to your provisional cast on. You can also just provisionally cast on if you are not sure the length of something is gonna be and if you want to change it later. So for example, if you were knitting something that was bottom up and you weren't so sure at like the length of it and you want to be able to have the option to extend it later, you do provisional cast on. This is one that I have not learned by heart. This is one that I have to look up every single time, and there are different ways of doing it. I think the version that uses crochet, if I'm remembering correctly, is my favorite one at this point, where you use like a crochet hook and a knitting needle. Again, I don't know it by heart. This one is really kind of complicated for me, especially because like there's all these different types of cast-ons, and I only really know the long tail one by heart, and all of the other ones I always have to look up. So, you know, even when people have been knitting for a while, you don't have to learn everything by heart. Is kind of my lesson of this. Some of them you will do them enough. Some of these techniques you will do them enough that you will end up learning them by heart. But some of them, like, it's fine to just Google them every time, but at least be aware that they exist and how they sort of work, and that you are looking for the right thing and why you do them. I think it's a good way of kind of approaching these techniques. And last but not least is one of my favorite techniques, which is the Icord. And the Icord is kind of like the name suggests. You use a few stitches to create a sort of rounded cord that can be as long as you want it to be and as thick as you want it to be, and it kind of helps to literally create like a long cord. So it could be used for making like a drawstring that you could use on literally anything. It can be used for straps and tops. It can be used for really if you just want a long cord of knitting, and you know, I've used them to decorate Christmas trees. You can also do Icord that is kind of attached to something in your pattern. So for example, a lot of summer patterns that are sleeveless, instead of having like an open raw edge at the sleeve, sometimes you will have an Icord finishing where it's kind of attached to the end, and it creates kind of that like nice finished edge to the top. And it is using an Icord technique, except this time instead of being like an individual Icord, it is kind of attached to the rest of your knitting. And the way that it works is really you only need like 3, 4, 5-ish stitches depending on the thickness of the Icord. And what you do is you knit a row, and instead of turning your work around, you basically just go back to the beginning and continue and knit another row, and you go back to the beginning. And as you keep going doing this, it creates that kind of like rounded long kind of cord shape. And it is not hard to do, it just looks complicated, and first time you do it, it might not really gonna get how to do it. But again, just following a tutorial, I think anyone can finish it off and make yourself look like way more advanced than you maybe are. So these are the 5 techniques that I find will distinguish you from like a very beginner knitter to like a more advanced seasoned one. You will encounter them in a lot of patterns. So if you see the words again, you'll know what they are, you'll know what to look for, and you hopefully kind of understand why they're being added into a pattern. And I invite you to not be scared if you find patterns that use these kinds of techniques, If you have any more suggestions of complicated stitches that you are scared of trying, or techniques that you have heard of but don't really understand, please leave them in the comments, or that you thought were really scary and difficult but then you actually try them and love them. And if you haven't seen my other video where I talk about difficult or advanced techniques, look down on my description to find that link. I will see you on the next one, and happy knitting.